He mocked my $43, so I pulled a folder that cut off his swagger, exposing his secret debt and an ultimatum that left him and my daughter shocked. The moment my son-in-law Marcus laughed at my savings account balance, something shifted inside me that I hadn't felt in decades. It wasn't anger exactly, more like the cold precision of a chess master who'd just realized his opponent had made a fatal mistake. See, Marcus thought he was looking at a broken old man with $43.16 to his name. What he didn't know was that he was staring at someone who'd spent 30 years learning exactly how the financial world really works. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The kitchen felt smaller that Tuesday morning when Marcus strutted in wearing his designer suit, the one my daughter Sarah had probably paid for with her teacher's salary. He moved with that particular swagger of someone who'd never actually built anything himself, but had convinced everyone around him that he was destined for greatness. His eyes swept across our modest breakfast table, taking in the chipped ceramic mugs and the generic brand cereal like he was documenting evidence of our failures. "Dad, we need to talk about your situation." His voice carried that tone people use when they're about to explain why you should be grateful for their intervention. "Sarah and I have been discussing your finances, and frankly, we're concerned about your future security." I set down my coffee mug carefully, the same blue ceramic one Margaret had bought me for Father's Day 12 years ago. Marcus had never asked about Margaret, never wondered why her chair at the kitchen table stayed empty, never shown the slightest curiosity about the woman who'd raised the daughter he claimed to love. But then again, people like Marcus rarely asked questions about things that didn't directly benefit them. "My finances are fine, Marcus." I kept my voice level, conversational. "But thank you for your concern." "Fine?" He pulled out his phone with the dramatic flair of someone revealing smoking gun evidence. "Dad, I've been tracking your spending patterns, the amount you contribute to household expenses, your grocery receipts, the fact that you're still driving that ancient pickup truck." He gestured toward the window where my 15-year-old Ford sat in the driveway. This isn't sustainable. The irony was breathtaking. Marcus, who hadn't held a steady job in 8 months, was lecturing me about financial sustainability. Marcus, whose credit cards I'd seen Sarah frantically shuffling money between to avoid late fees. Marcus, who drove a BMW that cost more than most people made in a year while contributing exactly $0 to the household budget. "I've been taking care of myself for 64 years, son. I managed just fine before you arrived." His laugh started as a chuckle but built into something uglier, more condescending. "That's exactly the problem. You're stuck in the past, making decisions based on outdated thinking." He leaned forward, his eyes bright with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found a new target for his superior wisdom. "Do you want to know what your problem is?" I didn't particularly want to know, but Marcus had never let anyone's actual preferences interfere with his monologues. "You're too conservative with money, too afraid to take risks, too content with mediocrity." He gestured around our kitchen like he was indicating the ruins of a failed civilization. "Look at this place. Look at your life. You've been playing it safe for so long that you've forgotten how to win." The kitchen clock ticked steadily above the sink, marking seconds that felt heavy with the weight of accumulated insults. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Patterson from next door watering her roses, the same roses she'd been tending for 23 years. Normal people living normal lives, making normal choices that didn't require justification to anyone. Sarah appeared in the doorway, coffee mug in hand, her face carrying that careful neutrality she'd perfected during these conversations. She looked tired, older than her 31 years, with the kind of exhaustion that came from managing other people's problems while neglecting your own needs. "Morning, Dad." Her voice held genuine warmth, the same tone she'd used as a little girl when she'd crawl into bed with Margaret and me during thunderstorms. "What are you two talking about?" Marcus turned toward his wife, with the satisfied expression of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "I was just explaining to your father why his financial strategy isn't working anymore. We need to help him understand modern wealth-building principles." Modern wealth-building principles. I'd heard Marcus use that phrase before, usually right before he asked to borrow money or pitched some investment opportunity that would revolutionize everything if we just had the vision to see it. "Dad's doing fine, Marcus." Sarah's voice carried a warning edge that her husband either didn't hear or chose to ignore. "Fine isn't good enough anymore, sweetheart." Marcus stood up, pacing to the window where he could gesture toward my pickup truck. "Your father's sitting on decades of earning potential that he's completely wasted. Do you know what compound interest could have done with proper investment strategies?" I knew exactly what compound interest could do. I'd been watching it work for 30 years, in ways that Marcus couldn't begin to imagine. "Sarah, maybe you should show your husband my bank statement," I said quietly, not looking up from my coffee. Marcus spun around, his eyes lighting up with predatory interest. "Absolutely. Full transparency is exactly what this family needs. How much are we working with here?" Sarah disappeared into the hallway where we kept the filing cabinet, her footsteps echoing against hardwood floors that had witnessed decades of family conversations. Normal conversations between people who respected each other, who understood that love didn't require financial performance metrics. She returned with the manila folder that contained our household financial documents, the ones Marcus had been not so subtly asking to see for months. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it, and I wondered if she was nervous about my reaction to this invasion of privacy or worried about what Marcus might discover. "Here." She pulled out the single-page bank statement from First National, the one that showed my checking account balance in stark black numbers. $43.16, just like Marcus had suspected. The silence stretched for exactly 4 seconds before Marcus erupted into laughter. Not the warm laughter of someone sharing joy, but the cruel amusement of someone who just confirmed their worst assumptions about another person's incompetence. $43. He could barely speak through his laughter. $43.16. "Dad, this is even worse than I thought." "Marcus, stop it." Sarah's voice cracked with embarrassment, whether for me or for her husband's behavior, I couldn't tell. But Marcus was just getting started. He grabbed the bank statement, holding it up like evidence in a courtroom. "This is what I'm talking about, Sarah. This is what happens when someone refuses to adapt, refuses to think strategically about money. Your father has worked for 40 years, and this is what he has to show for it." The kitchen felt smaller, with Marcus's voice bouncing off the walls, his words echoing with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally proven their point. I watched my daughter's face crumble as she absorbed what she thought was the devastating proof of her father's financial failure. $43, Marcus repeated, shaking his head with theatrical disappointment. "Dad, I don't want to hurt your feelings, but this is just sad. A man your age should have at least 6 figures in savings, probably 7. You should own property, have investment portfolios, retirement accounts that could support you for decades." He was warming to his theme now, pacing around our kitchen like a prosecutor delivering closing arguments to a jury that had already made up its mind. "Do you understand what this means for your future? For Sarah's future when she has to take care of you? This isn't just about you anymore. Your financial irresponsibility affects everyone in this family." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had burned down everything I'd thought I knew about my place in my daughter's life. Through the window, Mrs. Patterson was still tending her roses, probably unaware that her neighbor's entire existence was being dissected and found wanting just 30 feet away. Marcus set the bank statement down on the table with exaggerated gentleness, like he was handling evidence of a crime. "Dad, I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying it because someone needs to tell you the truth. You've wasted your life financially, and now it's time to face reality." Sarah hadn't said a word during Marcus's performance, but I could see tears forming in her eyes. Whether they were tears of pity for her father or frustration with her husband's cruelty, I couldn't tell. Maybe both. I stood up slowly, my 64-year-old joints protesting after sitting through Marcus's financial intervention. The kitchen suddenly felt too small for all the disappointment and judgment that filled it like toxic gas. "Marcus," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt in my chest, "you're absolutely right about one thing." His eyebrows rose with interest, probably expecting an admission of defeat or a request for his guidance on how to salvage the wreckage of my financial life. "I've been playing it safe for a very long time. Too safe, probably. Too conservative. Too afraid to make the kind of bold moves that separate the winners from the losers." Marcus nodded eagerly, sensing victory. "Exactly. That's exactly what I've been trying to tell you." I walked to the kitchen drawer where Margaret used to keep the important papers, the ones she'd organized with the meticulous care she brought to everything that mattered to our family. My fingers found the folder I was looking for, the thick manila envelope that contained documents Marcus had never seen. "You know what, son? I think it's time I stopped being so conservative with my money. Time I started taking some real risks, making some bold financial moves that might surprise everyone." The folder felt heavy in my hands as I carried it back to the table, where Marcus waited with the confident smile of someone who believed he'd just converted another financial sinner to his gospel of modern wealth building. "What I'm about to show you," I continued, "might change how you think about risk and reward, about what it really means to play it safe versus what it means to bet everything on a single strategy." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes bright with curiosity and anticipation. He had no idea that his $43 lecture was about to become the most expensive conversation of his life. I opened the manila folder with the deliberate precision of someone who'd been waiting 30 years for exactly this moment. The first document I pulled out was a simple letterhead from Whitmore, Patterson and Associates, Investment Management. The paper was cream-colored, expensive, the kind that whispered rather than shouted about the money behind it. Marcus's confident smile flickered slightly as I spread the papers across our kitchen table, the same table where Sarah had done her homework 20 years ago, where Margaret and I had planned family vacations and discussed dreams that seemed impossible at the time. "This is my investment portfolio summary from last quarter," I said, sliding the first page toward Marcus. His eyes moved across the numbers, and I watched his expression change like someone trying to solve a puzzle that kept rearranging itself. The silence stretched for 10 seconds before Marcus spoke, his voice smaller than it had been moments earlier. "This says 2.7 million. "That's just the primary portfolio," I replied, pulling out another document. "This one shows my real estate investments. 17 properties across 3 states, all fully paid off, generating about $48,000 in rental income monthly." Sarah's coffee mug hit the table with a sharp clink. "Dad, what is this?" Marcus was staring at the papers like they were written in a foreign language he'd never learned to read. His mouth opened and closed without sound, the same way a fish looks when it suddenly realizes it's been pulled from the water. The third document was my favorite, a statement from my business brokerage account showing stock positions in companies Marcus had probably never heard of, but whose products he used every day. Small manufacturers, specialty chemical companies, logistics firms that moved goods behind the scenes while flashier businesses got all the attention. "This portfolio focuses on dividend-paying stocks," I explained, my voice taking on the educational tone I used to use when Sarah was young and curious about how things worked. Not sexy investments, not the kind that make headlines or impress people at cocktail parties. But they've been paying me between 12 and 15% annually for the past 28 years. Marcus found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. "How is this possible?" The answer required going back to 1987, when I was 34 years old and working as a maintenance supervisor at the paper mill. Margaret was pregnant with Sarah, and we were living in a 2-bedroom apartment that smelled like industrial chemicals and broken dreams. Most nights, I'd come home with my hands stained from machinery grease, my back aching from crawling through equipment spaces that weren't designed for human comfort. "I started reading," I said, settling back into my chair. "Not investment magazines or get-rich-quick books. I read annual reports from companies, SEC filings, patent applications. Boring stuff that most people never bother with because it doesn't promise overnight success." The kitchen felt different now, like the air itself had changed composition. Marcus was still staring at the documents, his brain apparently struggling to reconcile the numbers with everything he thought he knew about his father-in-law. "There was a company called Midwest Precision Components," I continued. "They made tiny metal parts for medical devices, nothing glamorous. But every pacemaker, every surgical instrument, every piece of equipment that kept people alive needed these little components. The stock was trading at $4 a share because nobody understood what they actually did." Sarah was listening with the intensity of someone hearing a story that rewrote her understanding of her own childhood. All those years when she'd thought we were struggling, when she'd worn second-hand clothes and eaten generic brand cereal, her father had been quietly building an empire, one dividend payment at a time. "I bought 2,000 shares with money I'd saved from working double shifts," I said. $4,800, which was about 3 months' salary at the time. Margaret thought I'd lost my mind. spending our emergency fund on a company she'd never heard of. The investment had seemed insane to everyone who knew about it. The mill workers thought I was putting on airs, trying to pretend I was something more than a maintenance guy who got his hands dirty for a living. Margaret's family, who'd never trusted my judgment about anything more complicated than changing oil, saw it as proof that I was irresponsible with money. But I'd done the research. I'd read every filing, studied their customer contracts, understood that medical device manufacturing was going to explode as the population aged. While everyone else was chasing hot stocks and flashy IPOs, I was buying shares in companies that made boring essential products nobody could live without. Midwest Precision got acquired by Johnson & Johnson in 1994, I said, pulling out a yellowed newspaper clipping I'd saved for nearly 30 years. 7 years after I bought it for $4 a share, J&J paid $68 per share. My $4,800 investment became $136,000 overnight. Marcus was doing math in his head, his lips moving silently as he calculated returns that violated everything he thought he knew about conservative investing. A 2,800% return on a stock that nobody had ever heard of, held by a maintenance worker who read annual reports like other people read novels. But that was just the beginning, I continued. I took that $136,000 and spread it across 12 similar companies. Small manufacturers making essential components for growing industries. Nothing exciting, nothing that would impress anyone at a dinner party. Just boring businesses with strong balance sheets and products people couldn't do without. The kitchen clock ticked steadily as I explained 3 decades of patient investment decisions. How I'd bought stock in a small logistics company that specialized in moving medical waste, years before anyone realized that healthcare waste management would become a billion-dollar industry. How I'd invested in a family-owned business that made specialized filters for water treatment plants, back when clean water was still taken for granted. Each investment had seemed unremarkable at the time. Blue-collar companies serving unglamorous but essential needs, run by practical people who understood that steady profits beat spectacular headlines. While other investors chased technology stocks and trendy sectors, I was buying shares in companies that made the bolts that held bridges together, the chemicals that kept swimming pools clean, the software that managed inventory in warehouses nobody ever saw. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because I wanted you to understand the value of earning your own way," I replied. "I wanted you to appreciate what you had instead of taking it for granted. Margaret and I decided that you should grow up knowing what it meant to work for things, not just have them handed to you." The decision had cost us countless arguments over the years. When Sarah's friends got new cars for their 16th birthdays, when she had to work summers to pay for college expenses that we could have easily covered, when she chose teaching over more lucrative careers because she thought money would always be tight. Every choice had been shaped by her belief that we were just getting by, that financial security was something other families enjoyed. Marcus finally found his voice, though it sounded different than it had 20 minutes earlier. "If you have all this money, why do you live like this? Why drive that old truck? Why shop at discount stores?" "Because money is a tool, not a trophy," I said. "Because the moment you start spending to impress people, you stop building wealth and start destroying it. Because every dollar you waste on status symbols is a dollar that can't grow into $10 over time." The truth was more complicated than that, involving lessons I'd learned from watching wealthy families destroy themselves through entitlement and excess. But Marcus wasn't ready for those lessons yet. He was still processing the basic revelation that his father-in-law wasn't the financial failure he'd assumed. I pulled out the final document, a legal paper that would change everything Marcus thought he knew about his own situation. "This is a promissory note," I said, sliding it across the table. "A loan agreement for $200,000, secured against future earnings and current assets." Marcus's eyes widened as he read his own name at the top of the document. "When did I sign this?" "You didn't," I replied. "But your wife did, as your legal representative, after you defaulted on your credit card payments, your car loan, and your student loans. She came to me 6 months ago, desperate to save your credit rating before the bank started foreclosure proceedings." The kitchen felt colder as the implications sank in. Sarah had been carrying this burden alone, too proud or too scared to tell her husband that their financial house of cards had collapsed. too ashamed to admit that her father, the man Marcus mocked for his conservative approach to money, had become their family's silent savior. $200,000, I continued, to pay off your debts and give you a fresh start. The terms are quite generous, actually. 3% interest, payments deferred until you find stable employment. No collateral required except your promise to treat my daughter with the respect she deserves. Marcus's hands were shaking as he held the promissory note, reading terms he'd never seen before because Sarah had handled everything while he'd been busy critiquing other people's financial strategies. The document was thorough, legally binding, and written in language that made clear exactly who held the power in this relationship. The beautiful part about having real wealth, I said, standing up to refill my coffee mug, is that it gives you choices. You can help people you care about, invest in opportunities others can't see, and sleep peacefully knowing that your future is secure regardless of what happens in the economy. Through the window, Mrs. Patterson was still tending her roses, unaware that the conversation in our kitchen had just shifted the entire balance of power in our family. The morning sun slanted across our table, illuminating documents that revealed 30 years of patient planning and strategic thinking disguised as conservative mediocrity. Marcus set down the promissory note with trembling hands. I had no idea, he whispered. Most people don't, I replied. That's the point of real wealth. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. It just quietly creates opportunities and solves problems while everyone else is busy arguing about who's smarter. The room had gone completely silent except for the steady tick of the kitchen clock and the sound of Marcus's labored breathing. I could see him trying to process not just the numbers, but the complete reversal of everything he thought he understood about power dynamics in our family. The man who'd walked into this kitchen an hour ago, ready to lecture me about financial responsibility, was now staring at legal documents that made him realize he'd been drowning while mocking his lifeguard. Sarah broke the silence first, her voice barely audible. Dad, I'm so sorry. I should have told him, but I was ashamed. Ashamed that we needed help. Ashamed that I had to come to you after all the times he'd criticized your choices. Her words hit harder than Marcus's earlier mockery. My daughter, who'd inherited her mother's fierce independence and pride, had been carrying this burden alone for 6 months. She'd watched her husband ridicule the very man who'd secretly saved their financial lives, too embarrassed to reveal the truth that would have ended the charade immediately. You have nothing to be ashamed of, sweetheart. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. That's what family does. We help each other without keeping score, without conditions, without making anyone feel small for needing support. Marcus was still staring at the promissory note like it might change if he looked at it long enough. His designer suit, his confident posture, his entire persona had deflated like a balloon with a slow leak. The transformation was almost pitiful, watching someone's self-image crumble in real time. I don't understand, he said finally. If you could afford to loan us $200,000, why didn't you just tell me? Why let me think you were struggling? Because telling you wouldn't have taught you anything, I replied. Because people like you need to discover truth through experience, not through lectures. Because sometimes the most valuable lessons come from realizing how wrong you've been about everything you thought you knew. The kitchen felt smaller with all this truth filling the space between us. I walked to the window where Mrs. Patterson was still working in her garden, her movements steady and purposeful. She'd been tending those roses for over 2 decades, understanding that real beauty came from patient cultivation, not dramatic gestures. Marcus, there's something else you need to understand about wealth, I said, turning back to face him. It's not just about having money. It's about having the wisdom to use it properly. And right now, you're failing that test spectacularly. His head snapped up, some of his old defensiveness flickering back to life. What do you mean? I mean that in the 6 months since I cleared your debts, you haven't changed a single spending habit. I pulled out another folder, this one containing credit card statements and bank records that Sarah had been sharing with me monthly as part of our loan agreement. You're still eating at restaurants you can't afford, still buying clothes that cost more than most people's mortgage payments, still living like money grows on trees. The evidence was damning and detailed. Receipts from upscale bistros where Marcus had taken potential business contacts, hoping to impress them with his apparent success. Charges for designer accessories and gadgets that served no purpose beyond status signaling. A lifestyle maintained through debt and delusion, funded by a father-in-law he'd considered beneath his notice. Sarah's face went pale as she recognized the pattern. "Marcus, you promised me you'd cut back on discretionary spending until you found steady work." But Marcus was already shifting into damage control mode, his voice taking on that familiar tone of injured innocence. "Those weren't discretionary expenses. Those were investments in my professional network. You have to spend money to make money, especially in my field." "Your field," I interrupted, "which appears to be spending other people's money while criticizing their financial decisions. What exactly is your field, Marcus? Because in the 8 months since you lost your last job, I haven't seen any evidence that you're actively working in any field at all." The question hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Sarah was looking at her husband with an expression I'd seen before, the same look Margaret used to get when she was trying to solve a puzzle that kept changing its shape. The look of someone beginning to see clearly after months of deliberate blindness. "I've been developing business opportunities," Marcus said, his voice defensive. "Building relationships, exploring ventures that could generate significant returns. You wouldn't understand because you think small, but I'm thinking about transformative wealth creation." Transformative wealth creation. The phrase would have been funny if it wasn't so tragic. Here was a man who'd never created a dollar of wealth in his life, lecturing someone who'd built millions through patient strategy and careful planning. It was like watching a drowning person critique their rescuer's swimming technique. "Marcus," I said quietly, "let me share something with you about transformative wealth creation. It doesn't happen through networking lunches and business development meetings. It happens through understanding value, recognizing opportunity, and having the discipline to act when others are too scared or too proud to make hard choices." I pulled out one more document, this one a simple spreadsheet that I'd prepared the night before, knowing this conversation was inevitable. It showed 2 columns, money in and money out, tracked monthly for the past 6 months. The numbers told a story that was impossible to argue with or explain away. "Since I cleared your debts in March, you've spent $14,000 more than you've earned. $14,000 of additional debt accumulated while you've been lecturing me about financial responsibility and modern wealth-building principles." Sarah's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the kitchen. She was staring at the spreadsheet like someone seeing the results of a medical test that confirmed their worst fears. All those months of believing her husband was working toward stability, when he'd actually been digging them deeper into a hole. "The beautiful thing about having real wealth," I continued, "is that it gives you perspective on what wealth actually costs. Every dollar Marcus has spent on status symbols and networking events could have been invested. Compounded over time, that $14,000 would have become $50,000, then $100,000, then more." But Marcus was shaking his head, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "You're making this sound worse than it is. Those expenses were necessary for building my career, for maintaining the kind of image that clients expect from someone in my position." "What position is that exactly?" The question came from Sarah, her voice carrying a sharpness I rarely heard from my diplomatic daughter. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like your position is unemployed husband who's spending my father's money while insulting my father's intelligence." The shift in family dynamics was happening in real time, like watching tectonic plates rearrange themselves. Sarah was finally seeing her husband clearly, without the romantic filters that had obscured his character for years. And Marcus was realizing that his carefully constructed image was crumbling under the weight of documented evidence. I walked back to my chair, feeling older than my 64 years, but also strangely energized. This conversation had been building for months, maybe years, and finally having everything in the open felt like lancing an infected wound. Painful, but necessary for healing. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," I said, settling back into my seat. "The terms of your loan are about to change." Marcus looked up sharply, fear flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the promissory note you signed has a performance clause. If you fail to demonstrate good faith effort toward financial responsibility, the loan becomes immediately payable in full. And based on what I've shown you today, you're in violation of that clause." The kitchen went completely silent. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking as the implications sank in. $200,000 due immediately to a man who couldn't even cover his monthly expenses without going deeper into debt. "However," I continued, I'm prepared to offer you a choice. A real choice, not the illusion of choice you've been operating under. Sarah was gripping her coffee mug so tightly I was afraid it might shatter. Marcus was staring at me with the expression of someone who'd just realized they were playing chess with a grandmaster while thinking it was checkers. Option 1, I said, counting off my fingers. You can pay back the $200,000 immediately, with interest. We can calculate fair market rates, probably around 8% annually, which would bring your total obligation to about $216,000. Marcus's face went ashen. I don't have that kind of money. I know. Which brings us to option 2. You can accept that your current approach to life isn't working, and let someone who actually understands money teach you how to build wealth properly. Not through networking lunches and business development fantasies, but through real work and real discipline. The offer hung between us like a bridge that Marcus could either cross or burn. I could see him calculating, trying to find some angle that would let him maintain his dignity while accepting help from the man he'd been mocking an hour earlier. What would that involve exactly? His voice was smaller now, stripped of the arrogance that had characterized our earlier conversation. It would involve you getting a real job, I said. Not a business development position or a consulting role or any other euphemism for unemployment. A job where you show up every day, do actual work, and receive a regular paycheck that you can count on. The suggestion seemed to physically pain him. Marcus had spent years crafting an image of himself as someone above traditional employment, someone whose talents were too sophisticated for conventional work arrangements. The idea of joining the ranks of ordinary people with ordinary jobs was apparently more terrifying than financial ruin. It would also involve you living within your means, I continued. No more restaurant meals that cost more than most families spend on groceries in a week. No more designer clothes purchased to maintain an image of success you haven't actually achieved. No more pretending to be wealthy while depending on other people's money to survive. Sarah was nodding slowly, and I could see relief mixing with sadness in her expression. Relief that someone was finally addressing the problems she'd been too loyal to name. Sadness that it had taken a confrontation like this to force the truth into the open. And most importantly, I said, looking directly at Marcus, it would involve you treating my daughter and me with the respect that family members deserve. No more condescending lectures about financial responsibility from someone who's never been financially responsible. No more mockery of choices you don't understand. No more acting like you're doing us a favor by accepting our help. The terms were non-negotiable, and Marcus seemed to understand that. His options had been reduced to 2. Accept reality and start building a life based on truth, or continue living in fantasy until the money ran out and the consequences became unavoidable. Through the window, Mrs. Patterson was gathering her gardening tools, her morning's work complete. She'd planted, watered, and pruned according to principles she'd learned through decades of experience. No shortcuts, no dramatic gestures, just patient cultivation that produced beautiful results over time. That's how real wealth works, I realized. Not through brilliant insights or revolutionary strategies, but through understanding what actually matters and having the discipline to act on that understanding consistently, year after year, regardless of what other people think or say. Marcus was still staring at the documents spread across our kitchen table, the evidence of 30 years of patient planning and 6 months of reckless spending. The choice before him wasn't really about money. It was about character, about whether he could swallow his pride long enough to learn from someone he'd considered his inferior. The clock resumed its steady ticking, marking time that would either be used wisely or wasted, depending on the decisions made in the next few minutes. And for the first time since this conversation began, I felt genuinely curious about which choice my son-in-law would make. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Marcus's hands trembled as he reached for the promissory note again, reading his own signature at the bottom as if seeing it for the first time. Sarah sat frozen, her coffee growing cold while she processed the complete reversal of everything she'd believed about our family's financial situation. I could see the wheels turning in Marcus's head, that familiar calculation he did whenever he was trying to find an angle that would benefit him. But this time was different. This time, all his usual escape routes had been systematically blocked by documentation and truth. "You're really serious about this," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "The loan, the terms, all of it. Dead serious." I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of 30 years of careful planning behind my words. Marcus, you've spent the last hour explaining to me how the financial world works, how I've wasted my life through conservative thinking. But you've never actually succeeded at anything financially except spending other people's money. The observation hung in the air like smoke. Through the window, I could see the mailman making his rounds, delivering bills and checks and letters that would shape people's days in small but significant ways. Normal people dealing with normal financial realities, not the fantasy world Marcus had constructed around himself. Sarah finally broke the silence, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. Marcus, I need you to understand something. When I went to Dad for help, I was terrified. Terrified that we'd lose the house. Terrified that your credit would be destroyed. Terrified that I'd married someone who would drag us both down. Her words hit Marcus like physical blows. I could see him flinch with each admission, each revelation of how his behavior had affected the woman he claimed to love. I lied to you about working overtime, she continued. Those extra hours I said I was spending at school? I was working a second job, cleaning offices downtown after my teaching day ended, trying to keep up with the credit card payments you kept making without telling me. The kitchen felt smaller, with this new truth filling the space between us. My daughter, who'd inherited Margaret's pride and work ethic, had been scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans to cover her husband's spending habits. The image made my chest tighten with anger and admiration in equal measure. Marcus's face crumpled as the full scope of his selfishness became clear. Sarah, I didn't know. You never said anything about a second job. Because I was ashamed, she replied, her voice gaining strength. Ashamed that my husband, who talks constantly about wealth building and financial strategy, couldn't even manage our basic monthly expenses. Ashamed that I had to beg my father for money while you criticized his financial choices. I pulled out another document from my folder, this one a simple timeline I'd prepared, showing Marcus's employment history over the past 3 years. The pattern was clear and damning. 6 different jobs, each lasting between 2 and 8 months, each ending with Marcus's explanation that he was overqualified or underappreciated, or dealing with management that couldn't recognize his potential. This is your professional track record, I said, sliding the paper toward him. 6 jobs in 36 months. Each time you convinced Sarah that the next opportunity would be different, that your talents would finally be recognized and rewarded appropriately. Marcus stared at the timeline like he was seeing his own failures mapped out in black and white for the first time. The truth was undeniable when presented this way. He wasn't a misunderstood genius waiting for the right opportunity. He was someone who couldn't hold a job because he considered himself above the basic requirements of showing up, working hard, and treating colleagues with respect. The longest you've held any position was 8 months, I continued. And that ended when you decided your supervisor was holding you back from reaching your full potential. Do you remember what Sarah told me about that conversation with your boss? His face flushed red as the memory surfaced. That situation was complicated. There were personality conflicts, office politics that someone with your background wouldn't understand. Your boss told you that success required doing the work assigned to you before trying to redesign the entire company structure, Sarah said quietly. He told you that building trust meant completing projects on time, not pitching new initiatives every week. The truth was even more damaging than Marcus's selective memory wanted to acknowledge. His supervisor had actually praised his intelligence and creativity while pointing out that those qualities meant nothing without the discipline to execute basic responsibilities. But Marcus had heard only criticism, not constructive feedback that could have helped him grow. I've watched this pattern repeat itself for 3 years, I said, my voice taking on the educational tone I'd used when Sarah was young and needed to understand difficult concepts. You get hired based on potential, but you never fulfill that potential because you're always focused on the next level instead of mastering your current responsibilities. The kitchen clock ticked steadily as Marcus absorbed this assessment of his character. Outside, Mrs. Patterson was wheeling her trash can to the curb, performing one of those mundane but necessary tasks that kept communities functioning. Simple work done consistently, without fanfare or recognition, but essential nonetheless. That's the difference between people who build wealth and people who just talk about it, I continued. Wealth comes from mastering fundamentals before attempting advanced strategies. It comes from doing boring work excellently before trying to revolutionize industries. Marcus was nodding slowly, and I could see something shifting in his expression. Not full acceptance yet, but the beginning of recognition that his approach hadn't been working. The first crack in the armor of self-deception that had protected him from acknowledging his failures. Sarah reached across the table and touched his hand, her gesture carrying both love and exhaustion. Marcus, I need you to hear what Dad is offering. Not just the money, but the chance to actually learn from someone who succeeded at building wealth over time. The offer was more generous than Marcus deserved, considering how he'd treated both Sarah and me. But it was also strategic. I'd learned from watching other wealthy families that money without wisdom destroyed more lives than it saved. Marcus needed education more than he needed forgiveness. I stood up and walked to the kitchen sink, looking out at the neighborhood where I'd lived for 23 years. Modest homes occupied by working families who understood that security came from consistent effort, not brilliant schemes. People who might never be wealthy but who lived with dignity and purpose. Marcus, there's something else you need to understand about real wealth, I said, turning back to face him. It's not just about having money. It's about having the character to handle money responsibly. And right now, you don't have that character. The words were harsh but necessary. I'd watched too many lottery winners and inheritance recipients destroy their lives through lack of preparation. Money amplified existing character traits, both good and bad. Someone who was irresponsible with $1,000 would be catastrophically irresponsible with $1 million. But character can be developed, I continued. It can be learned through experience, through mentorship, through the kind of failure that forces you to confront reality instead of hiding behind excuses. Marcus looked up at me with something that might have been hope mixed with desperation. What exactly are you proposing? A complete reset of your relationship with money, work, and responsibility. I sat back down, pulling out the final document from my folder. This was a detailed plan I'd developed over several sleepless nights, a roadmap for transforming Marcus from a financial liability into someone capable of building his own wealth. First, you get a job within 30 days. Not a consulting position, not a business development role, but an actual job where you report to someone else and perform specific duties for agreed-upon compensation. The work might be beneath your self-image, but it'll teach you things about reliability and humility that you've never learned. His face showed resistance, but he didn't argue. The weight of $200,000 in debt was apparently enough to overcome his pride, at least temporarily. Second, you live on Sarah's teacher salary alone for 1 full year. Every penny you earn goes toward paying down debt and building an emergency fund. No exceptions, no special circumstances, no investments in future opportunities that require current spending. Sarah's eyes widened as she realized what this would mean for their lifestyle. No more restaurant meals, no more designer clothes, no more maintaining the image of success that had become so important to Marcus's self-concept. They'd be living like most young couples actually lived, paycheck to paycheck while building toward something better. Third, you attend financial literacy classes at the community college. Not the kind that promise quick wealth through real estate flipping or cryptocurrency trading, but basic courses about budgeting, saving, and investing in index funds. Boring education that actually works. Marcus was taking notes now, writing down requirements that would reshape his entire existence. I could see him struggling with the implications, the complete dismantling of the lifestyle he'd constructed through debt and delusion. Fourth, and this is non-negotiable, you treat Sarah with the respect she deserves. No more financial decisions made without her knowledge. No more criticism of her conservative approach to money. No more making her feel guilty for working 2 jobs while you chase fantasies. The requirement seemed to hit him harder than the financial restrictions. Perhaps because it addressed the core problem that had created all the other issues, his inability to see other people as anything more than supporting characters in his personal success story. And finally, I said, looking directly into his eyes, you acknowledge that you don't know what you're talking about when it comes to building wealth. You stop giving financial advice to anyone, especially me, until you've actually demonstrated the ability to create value instead of just consuming it. The kitchen went completely silent except for the sound of Marcus's pen scratching against paper. Sarah was watching her husband with an expression I couldn't quite read, hope and skepticism battling for control of her features. These aren't suggestions, Marcus. They're conditions for avoiding immediate repayment of your loan. If you violate any of them, the full amount becomes due within 30 days, and I'll pursue collection through legal channels." The threat was real and legally binding. I'd learned from other wealthy families that generosity without accountability was just enabling dressed up in kinder language. Marcus needed consequences that would force him to change, not just promises he could break when the pressure eased. He set down his pen and looked at the list he'd written, 5 requirements that would transform him from a pretentious debtor into someone capable of building his own financial security. The man who'd walked into this kitchen ready to lecture me about conservative thinking was now staring at a roadmap for the kind of conservative approach he'd been mocking. "Can I ask you something?" His voice was different now, smaller and more genuine than I'd heard from him in years. "Of course. Why are you doing this? After everything I've said, all the ways I've disrespected you and Sarah, why offer me another chance instead of just demanding payment?" The question deserved a thoughtful answer. I looked at my daughter, seeing Margaret's strength and kindness reflected in her face, remembering all the conversations we'd had about what it meant to build a family that would last beyond any individual member's lifetime. "Because Sarah loves you," I said simply, "and because I believe people can change when they finally understand the cost of not changing. You've been living in a fantasy for 3 years, Marcus. This morning, that fantasy ended. What happens next depends entirely on whether you're brave enough to live in reality." The choice was his to make, and I could see him wrestling with it in real time. Everything he'd built his identity around, his sophistication, his business acumen, his superiority to people like me, was being revealed as elaborate self-deception. The question was whether he had the courage to abandon those illusions and start building something real. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Patterson sweeping her front porch, the same methodical attention to simple tasks that had kept her home beautiful for decades. Real success, I'd learned, came from mastering ordinary responsibilities before attempting extraordinary achievements. The clock kept ticking, marking time that could either be wasted on continued delusion or invested in the slow work of building character and competence. And for the first time since this conversation began, I genuinely didn't know which choice Marcus would make. Marcus stared at the list for a long time, his pen still clutched in his white-knuckled grip. I could see the war happening behind his eyes, the collision between the man he'd pretended to be and the reality he was finally being forced to confront. The silence stretched until even the kitchen clock seemed to hold its breath. When he finally looked up, something fundamental had shifted in his expression. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something I'd never seen from him before. Genuine humility tinged with fear. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "All of it. The job, the budget, the classes, everything." Sarah's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room. She'd been holding herself so rigidly that I wondered if she'd forgotten to breathe during the past few minutes. Her hand found Marcus's across the table, and I saw tears she'd been fighting finally spill over. "But I need you to know something," Marcus continued, his voice stronger now. "I've been an absolute fool. Not just about money, but about what really matters. I convinced myself that I was too good for ordinary work, too sophisticated for simple solutions. I turned my wife into my personal bank while criticizing the man who was actually saving us both." He stood up slowly, walked around the table, and extended his hand to me. Not the casual handshake of someone going through social motions, but the firm grip of someone making a real commitment. "Mr. Morrison, I owe you more than $200,000. I owe you an apology for every condescending word, every eye roll when you offered advice, every time I made Sarah feel like she had to choose between defending her father and keeping peace with her husband. I've been everything you raised her not to marry." I shook his hand, feeling calluses that hadn't been there 6 months ago. Maybe he'd been doing more actual work than I'd realized, even if he hadn't been admitting it to himself or anyone else. "Marcus, apologies are words. What matters now is what you do with the next 5 years of your life. You can spend them proving that people can change, or you can spend them making the same mistakes in a different setting." Sarah was crying openly now, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were the tears of someone who'd been carrying an impossible weight and had finally been allowed to set it down. She looked at her husband like she was seeing him clearly for the first time in years. "I start job hunting tomorrow," Marcus said, his voice carrying a determination I'd never heard before. "Real jobs, The kind where I show up every day and do what I'm told until I earn the right to do more. No more networking lunches, no more business development fantasies. He turned to Sarah, taking both her hands in his. And I want you to quit that second job. Tonight. We'll make it work on your teaching salary and whatever I can earn, even if it means eating rice and beans for dinner and shopping at thrift stores. Marcus, you don't understand, Sarah started, but he shook his head. I understand perfectly. You've been cleaning offices after teaching all day because I was too proud to take a job that matched my actual qualifications instead of my imaginary ones. That ends now. The transformation was remarkable to watch. Not complete, certainly, but genuine. The first real crack in years of self-deception, and through that crack, I could see glimpses of the man Sarah had fallen in love with before success fantasies had poisoned his judgment. Over the next 6 months, I watched Marcus become someone I could actually respect. He took a job at the hardware store, 40 hours a week at $12 an hour, helping contractors find the right bolts and explaining the difference between various grades of sandpaper. Work that required him to be useful instead of impressive. The first month was brutal. I could see him struggling with the gap between his self-image and his reality, coming home exhausted not just physically but emotionally. But Sarah stood by him, and slowly something beautiful started happening. He began taking pride in knowing more about construction supplies than customers expected. He started building relationships with contractors who appreciated his attention to detail. By month 3, his manager was giving him additional responsibilities. By month 6, he was training new employees and being consulted on inventory decisions, not because he'd talked his way into advancement, but because he'd demonstrated reliability and competence in small things before attempting larger ones. The financial discipline was harder, but equally transformative. Watching Marcus calculate whether they could afford a $12 pizza instead of making pasta at home taught him lessons that no business school could provide. He learned the difference between wanting something and needing it, between image and substance. Sarah bloomed during those months like a flower that had finally received proper sunlight. She quit the cleaning job and started coming home to a husband who asked about her day instead of lecturing her about his unrealized potential. They began cooking together, taking walks in the evening, rediscovering the simple pleasures that debt and delusion had crowded out of their marriage. The community college classes were perhaps the most important part of Marcus's education. Sitting in a classroom with other adults who were learning basic financial principles forced him to confront how little he actually knew about money management. No more pretending that his sophisticated vocabulary masked fundamental ignorance. One evening in December, almost exactly a year after that confrontational morning in my kitchen, Marcus knocked on my door. He was carrying a manila folder, but his posture was different now. Confident without being arrogant, purposeful without being presumptuous. I wanted to show you something, he said, settling into the same kitchen chair where he'd laughed at my savings account balance 12 months earlier. The folder contained a simple budget spreadsheet, tracking every dollar earned and spent for the previous 6 months. At the bottom, a number that made me smile. $340 in savings, built slowly through discipline and sacrifice. It's not much, Marcus said, but it's ours. Every dollar earned honestly, spent carefully, saved intentionally. No debt, no borrowed money, no illusions about what we can actually afford. He pulled out another document, a business plan for a small contracting service he wanted to start. Not a grandiose scheme for instant wealth, but a realistic proposal for gradual growth based on skills he was actually developing and relationships he'd genuinely built. I'm not ready yet, he continued. Maybe not for another 2 years. But I wanted you to see that I'm thinking about the future differently now. Not looking for shortcuts or secret strategies, just planning to build something valuable through consistent effort over time. The plan was modest, but sound. Marcus had identified a niche in small home repairs and maintenance, work that required reliability more than brilliance. He'd calculated startup costs, projected realistic revenue, planned for seasonal variations in demand. Nothing revolutionary, but everything achievable. Sarah appeared in the doorway, carrying a plate of cookies she'd made from scratch instead of buying from the expensive bakery she used to frequent. The smile on her face was worth more than all the money I'd ever accumulated. "Dad, we have some news," she said, settling beside her husband with the easy comfort of people who'd rediscovered why they'd chosen each other in the first place. Marcus reached into his folder one more time, pulling out an official-looking document. "We want to start making payments on the loan. Not the full amount we owe, but something. $500 a month to start, increasing as my income grows." I looked at the payment schedule he'd prepared, carefully calculated to fit within their budget while still allowing for continued savings and unexpected expenses. It would take 8 years to pay off the full amount, but every payment would be made from money they'd actually earned rather than borrowed from somewhere else. "You don't have to do this," I said. "The original terms gave you much more flexibility." "We want to do this," Sarah replied. "We need to do this. Not because we're afraid of the consequences, but because we're finally ready to take responsibility for our choices." Looking at them across my kitchen table, I saw something I'd hoped for but hadn't dared expect. Two people who discovered that real wealth wasn't about impressing others or maintaining appearances. Real wealth was about having choices, building security, and sleeping peacefully, knowing that your life was built on truth instead of fantasy. Marcus had learned that laughing at someone else's savings account was the mark of a fool who didn't understand what real money looked like. More importantly, he'd learned that building wealth required the same virtues that built character: patience, discipline, humility, and the courage to do ordinary work extraordinarily well. The kitchen clock ticked steadily as we shook hands on their payment plan, marking time that would be invested wisely instead of wasted on illusions. Outside, Mrs. Patterson was preparing her garden for winter, covering roses that would bloom again in spring through careful preparation and patient cultivation. That's how real wealth grows, I realized, not through dramatic revelations or brilliant strategies, but through understanding what actually matters and having the character to act on that understanding, day after day, year after year, regardless of who's watching or what they think. The man who'd mocked my $43 was gone. In his place sat someone who understood that wealth began not with the amount in your account, but with the wisdom to build something lasting through honest work and careful choices. And for the first time in years, I felt genuinely proud to call him family. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.